He did not fear the dark at first. He only feared what the dark began to reveal to him. A man who had lived his entire adult life as a practicing Catholic suddenly found himself unable to sleep unless every light in his home stayed on until morning. At first, he blamed stress, work pressure, and the ordinary burdens of marriage and responsibility. But what seemed like a simple psychological strain slowly became something he could no longer explain away with normal reasoning. Something had changed in his home, and more importantly, in the space where he slept. When he came to speak with me, he sat rigidly across the room, hands tightly folded, as if even the act of speaking about it required restraint. He was in his mid-40s, not a man prone to superstition or emotional exaggeration. He went to Mass regularly, believed in the teachings of the Church, and lived outwardly like many faithful Catholics do. Yet for 4 months, his nights had become unlivable without artificial light filling every corner of the house. What he assumed was exhaustion was, in reality, something far more precise and far more unsettling. He told me that the feeling did not begin as fear. It began as awareness, a sense that he was not alone when he lay down at night, not a presence he could define, not something he could see, but something he felt with increasing certainty. It was as if attention itself had entered the room, directed at him, patient and unblinking. Over time, that sense developed into a quiet conviction that something was observing him from the darkness, waiting for him to become still. I asked him a single question before he continued. I asked what was hanging on the wall above his bed. He went silent immediately. That silence told me more than his words could have. In pastoral experience, there are moments where patterns repeat themselves so often that recognition becomes immediate. I had heard similar accounts enough times to understand that what seemed like a personal story was often a variation of something already known. For context, my name is Father Chad Ripperger. I am a Catholic priest with formal training in philosophy and theology, and I have been assigned under obedience to the ministry of exorcism. I did not choose this work out of personal interest. It is not the kind of assignment anyone seeks for comfort or curiosity. It is a responsibility given within the Church when discernment requires it. My approach is not emotional or sensational. It is analytical, because causes must be identified before conclusions are made. Over years of hearing confessions, visiting homes, and speaking with individuals in distress, I have learned to distinguish between imagination, psychological strain, and something more objective in its effects. The Church does not interpret every unusual experience as supernatural. Most are not. But there are cases where natural explanations fail to account for the consistency and pattern of what people describe. In this man's case, the object above his bed was central to everything he experienced. He eventually described it in detail. It was a carved wooden mask he had purchased years earlier while traveling. He had found it in a marketplace near a site where local religious practices still involved offerings made to spirits. The mask was dark wood, elongated in shape, with hollowed eyes and a fixed expression that could not easily be categorized as human or symbolic in a familiar way. He had been told it was old. He had been told it had been used in rituals. He admitted that he did not ask what those rituals were. He simply liked the way it felt in his hands and the way it looked on his bedroom wall. It became, in his words, an interesting piece of art. Visitors often noticed it, and he liked that attention. For a long period, nothing unusual happened. 2 years passed without incident, and he assumed it was harmless decoration. But gradually, something in his spiritual and interior life began to weaken. His prayer life, once steady, became irregular. Confession was no longer part of his routine. The holy water font near his door remained empty and forgotten. Without realizing it, the structure that had once anchored his spiritual life had slowly thinned, not through a single decision, but through neglect over time. And in that gradual weakening, something else seemed to take advantage of the space that had been left open. The first sign was not visual. It was not a shadow in the corner or a dramatic event that forced immediate attention. It was a smell. The man told me that his bedroom gradually developed an odor he could not identify and could not remove. It lingered lightly during the day, but became more noticeable as evening approached. He described it as the scent of something burned and then soaked by rain, like wet ash left behind after a fire had long since gone cold. He did everything a reasonable person would do. He washed the bedding repeatedly, cleaned the room from top to bottom, opened windows, checked for leaks, and searched for any practical source. Yet the odor remained. It seemed disconnected from the ordinary causes that usually explain such things. Sometimes it faded for a few hours, only to return stronger after sunset. The longer it remained unexplained, the more it occupied his thoughts. Then came the cold. Not the cold produced by a draft moving through a room, but a cold that settled in one specific place and stayed there. It was concentrated on the side of the bed directly beneath the mask. Night after night he found himself pulling farther away from that side without consciously deciding to do so. Eventually he was sleeping so close to his wife that she began asking why he crowded her side of the bed. He struggled to answer because the explanation sounded irrational even to him. The cold carried a strange consistency. It was present regardless of the season or the temperature in the house. Some nights the room itself felt comfortable, yet that particular area remained noticeably colder. He began checking vents and windows, convinced there had to be a physical explanation. None appeared. The phenomenon remained confined to the same location as though an invisible boundary had been drawn through the room. After that came the sounds. He did not describe them as loud noises or dramatic disturbances. In fact, he said they were almost below the threshold of hearing. What disturbed him most was that he felt them more than he heard them. A low vibration seemed to emerge during the deepest part of the night, usually after 2 a.m, when the body is heavy with sleep and the mind is least alert. Again and again he would wake suddenly with his heart racing. The sensation was always the same. He would surface from sleep with a certainty that something in the room was focused entirely on him. His eyes would move immediately toward the mask. The rational part of his mind insisted that nothing had changed. It was a piece of carved wood, hanging exactly where it had always hung. Yet another part of him felt as though the hollow eyes were no longer simply part of the carving. He knew that thought was impossible, and yet he experienced it with increasing force. Every night he argued with himself. Every night he explained away the feeling. Every night he turned on the lamp again. At this point, it is important to pause the story and explain what the Catholic tradition actually teaches. Without that foundation, everything that follows risks sounding like folklore or a ghost story. The Church's understanding is far more precise than that. The question is not whether strange experiences happen. The question is what causes them and how they should be understood. When St. Thomas Aquinas discusses angels in the Summa Theologica, particularly in the sections devoted to their nature and activity, he establishes something many modern people have never been taught. A fallen angel remains an angel. Its rebellion against God corrupted its will, but it did not destroy its natural capacities. The intelligence remains, the memory remains, the power proper to its nature remains. This is where modern assumptions often become inadequate. Many people imagine evil spirits as crude forces operating through obvious disturbances and dramatic manifestations. They picture noise, chaos, and spectacle. The tradition of the Church describes something very different. It describes intelligences that are disciplined, patient, and highly observant. They do not tire. They do not forget. They do not become distracted. They study human weakness with a persistence that exceeds our ability to imagine. That patience matters, because temptation and spiritual oppression rarely begin with dramatic events. They begin with observation. An intelligence that has existed far longer than any human life understands patterns of behavior. It understands habits, vulnerabilities, and moments of weakness. It knows the difference between a person standing firmly within the sacramental life of the Church and a person whose spiritual defenses have gradually eroded through neglect. And where is a human being most vulnerable? Not while actively praying, not while focused on work or surrounded by others. Vulnerability often increases during sleep, when conscious reasoning is inactive and the imagination remains active beneath the surface. The ancient Christian writers understood this clearly. They viewed the imagination as a real faculty of the soul, a place where images are stored, combined, and experienced. During sleep, that interior world becomes especially active. The scriptures themselves acknowledge the reality of spiritual conflict. In his first letter, St. Peter warns believers to remain watchful because the adversary prowls like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. The image is significant. A lion does not attack the strongest member of the herd in broad daylight. It waits. It isolates. It watches for weakness and opportunity. That is why objects associated with false worship or spiritual practices contrary to God were treated seriously throughout Christian history. The concern was never about the material itself. Wood remains wood, stone remains stone. The concern involved what the object represented, how it had been used, and what spiritual realities it had been connected to. The Church has long understood that symbols matter because human beings are shaped by the realities they invite into their lives. The mask hanging above this man's bed was not merely occupying wall space. It was positioned in the place where he spent his most defenseless hours. Night after night, it became the focus of fear, attention, and imagination. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, it had become a constant point of spiritual fixation. And as the Church has always warned, anything that continually directs the soul toward darkness rather than toward God deserves very careful examination. The story was only beginning, and what happened next would reveal just how serious that examination needed to become. The condition in the room did not remain static. It developed with a kind of progression that, in hindsight, the man could clearly recognize, though at the time he did not understand what he was witnessing. What began as subtle discomfort gradually shifted into something that shaped his behavior every night. He stopped thinking about sleep as rest and began thinking of it as something he had to endure. The bedroom, once ordinary, became a place he entered with hesitation. He also began to notice that his reactions were no longer fully voluntary. He would prepare for bed, turn off most of the lights, and then pause. There was always a moment of hesitation before darkness fully settled in. That moment became longer over time. Eventually, he no longer trusted himself to remain in the dark without immediately reacting. The light switch became the first thing he reached for after waking in the night, even before fully understanding why he had woken. What troubled him most was not only the sensation of being watched, but the certainty that the watching was focused and intentional. It was not a general fear of darkness. It was specific. It was directed toward the space where the mask hung. He would often find himself avoiding looking at it directly, even during the day. His attention would drift away from that corner of the room, as though some internal boundary was forming in his mind. At the same time, his prayer life, which had already weakened before these events, continued to diminish, not through deliberate rejection, but through quiet neglect. He would intend to pray and then postpone it. He would plan to return to confession and then delay it again. The pattern was gradual but consistent. The spiritual practices that once structured his life became less frequent, then occasional, and eventually absent. This is an important point in understanding what the Church has historically observed in similar cases. The weakening of spiritual discipline rarely happens in a single decisive moment. It happens through small omissions that accumulate over time. When the ordinary practices of faith are no longer present, the sense of interior stability that comes from them also begins to fade. The person may not immediately recognize the connection, but the absence becomes noticeable in other areas of life. In this case, the man began to experience a growing sense of unease, not only at night but throughout the day. It was not constant terror, but a low level of tension that never fully left him. He described it as though part of his attention was always slightly divided, as if part of him remained behind in the room even when he was elsewhere. This created fatigue that he could not attribute to physical causes alone. There were also moments of intensified awareness during the night. He would wake suddenly without clear reason. There was no noise, no movement, nothing external that should have disturbed him, yet he would become alert instantly, with a strong sense that something had changed in the room. In those moments, his attention would immediately move toward the mask, as though drawn there against his own intention. What he experienced next was not a visual apparition, but a conviction that his perception itself had shifted. He began to feel that the mask was not simply an object being looked at, but something that was aware of being looked at. He understood rationally that this made no sense. He repeatedly told himself that it was carved wood, fixed in place, incapable of movement or awareness. Yet the experience persisted in a way that did not respond to reasoning. This is where the Church's theological framework becomes essential, because it distinguishes between imagination, suggestion, and external influence. The tradition does not assume that every interior experience corresponds to an external reality. At the same time, It does not reduce all experience to purely psychological terms. It allows for the possibility that an external intelligence can interact with human faculties in subtle ways, particularly through imagination and sensation. St. Thomas Aquinas, in his treatment of angelic action, explains that higher intelligences can influence lower faculties indirectly. They do not control the will, but they can present images or impressions to the imagination in ways that affect perception. This is not portrayed as constant or arbitrary interference, but as a capacity that can be directed towards specific ends. In spiritual theology, this is often discussed under the category of obsession, meaning an influence that affects a person from the outside through their sensory and imaginative faculties. In the man's experience, this influence seemed to concentrate around the same focal point each night. The mask became not just an object in the room, but the center of his attention whether he intended it or not. Even when he tried to ignore it, his awareness returned to it repeatedly. This created a cycle in which fear and attention reinforced each other. The more he tried not to think about it, the more present it became in his awareness. He also began adjusting his physical position in the bed without consciously deciding to do so. Over time, he found himself moving farther away from that side of the room. It was not a sudden movement, but a gradual shift, night after night, until his sleeping position was noticeably altered. When his wife asked about it, he could not give a clear explanation. He only knew that remaining close to that side felt increasingly difficult. At this stage, the situation had reached a point where ordinary explanations no longer provided relief for him. Psychological stress alone could not fully account for the consistency of the experiences or their specific focus. Something had anchored itself in his perception of that space, shaping both his fear and his behavior. And as he would soon discover, the turning point would come not from understanding it intellectually, but from confronting the object itself in a very direct way. At this stage, the man's life had narrowed in a very specific way. He was still functioning outwardly. He went to work, spoke with his family, and carried out normal responsibilities. But internally, his attention kept returning to a single point in the house. Everything else felt secondary. The bedroom was no longer just a place of rest. It had become the center of a quiet but constant inner struggle. What made the situation more difficult was that he still tried to reason his way out of it. He repeatedly told himself that nothing objective was happening. He would stand in the room during the day and look at the mask directly, trying to reduce its influence through familiarity. In daylight, it appeared to be nothing more than carved wood. Yet this intellectual clarity did not carry over into the night. When darkness came, the same certainty would return, and with it the same physical and emotional response. He also noticed a deepening exhaustion that was not fully explained by lack of sleep alone. It was as though his body was resting, but his mind was not fully recovering. The nights were fragmented by waking moments, each one carrying the same immediate awareness of the room and the same pull of attention toward the wall above the bed. Over time, this created a sense of instability that he could no longer ignore. Eventually, he reached a point where he could not continue as he was. He sought guidance from a priest he trusted, someone who took these matters seriously without immediately dismissing them or exaggerating them. That priest, after hearing his account, directed him to me for further evaluation. When he arrived, it was clear that he was not looking for speculation. He was looking for resolution. The first instruction I gave him was simple and direct. The object above his bed needed to be removed before he slept another night. Not stored elsewhere in the home, not set aside for later consideration, but taken down completely. The reason for this instruction is not based on superstition, but on the principle that objects associated with spiritual corruption or false worship should not remain in places where a person is most vulnerable. He resisted at first, as most people do in situations like this. His resistance was not dramatic. It was rational in tone. He questioned whether the object itself could truly be responsible. He suggested that it might be harmless, that perhaps the timing of his experiences was coincidental, or that stress alone could explain the pattern. He also expressed embarrassment at the idea of attributing significance to a decorative item he had chosen himself. This hesitation is important, because it often reveals something deeper than the object itself. There is usually an internal conflict between what a person experiences and what they are willing to conclude from it. He was not irrational. He was trying to preserve a sense of normalcy in the face of something that challenged it. However, during the conversation, he mentioned something that changed the direction entirely. He recalled a specific moment when he had taken the mask down from the wall to paint the room. For a short period, it had been placed face down on the bed. During that time, he had experienced none of the symptoms that had troubled him for months. The room felt normal. The smell was absent. The heaviness he associated with the space was gone. He even rested briefly without fear or interruption. But once the painting was finished and the mask was returned to its place above the bed, the entire pattern resumed. The cold returned. The unease returned. The nighttime disturbances returned. This detail was not presented as an argument, but as a simple observation. Yet it carried significant weight, because it revealed a clear correlation between the object's placement and the experiences he was having. At that point, something shifted in his own perception. He began to see that his earlier explanations were no longer sufficient to account for what he himself had lived through. He did not yet fully understand the cause, but he could no longer deny the consistency of the effect. That realization led him to agree to remove it. That night, he took it down from the wall. He described the act as unexpectedly difficult, not because of physical resistance, but because of internal hesitation. It was as though a part of him did not want to complete the action. Nevertheless, he removed it. The brass hook came out of the wall, leaving a small mark that he later found difficult to look at without discomfort. Once removed, the object was not preserved or kept in storage. It was broken and destroyed. The decision to do so was intentional. In the Church's pastoral practice, objects believed to be spiritually compromised are not treated as neutral items to be reused or passed along. They are removed from use entirely to prevent continued association or influence. After the removal, a priest blessed the room. The space was not left as it was, but was intentionally reordered through prayer and sacramental blessing. A crucifix that had been properly blessed was placed where the mask had once hung. Alongside it, an image of the Blessed Virgin Mary was added, not as decoration, but as a deliberate act of reorientation toward God. In the days that followed, the changes were immediate in his account. The cold that had been localized in that area of the room ceased. The smell that had persisted for months disappeared. Most importantly, the sense of being observed during the night no longer returned. He began sleeping in the dark again, without turning on every light in the house. What matters here is not simply the removal of an object, but what that removal revealed. The Church does not teach that material things possess power in themselves. Wood and paint remain what they are, but it does recognize that human beings are deeply influenced by what they place their attention upon, especially in spaces where they are most vulnerable. And when those objects are associated with realities contrary to God, they can become points of spiritual disturbance. The man did not describe a sudden emotional transformation. He did not claim to have been healed in a dramatic sense. He simply returned to normal sleep. The disturbances stopped. The house became ordinary again. And for him, that return to ordinariness was itself the clearest sign that something had changed. From this point forward, the most important observation was not what he felt, but what stopped happening. The absence of the previous disturbances became more significant than their presence had ever been. He was no longer waking in the middle of the night with a sudden, unexplained certainty that something was in the room. The sense of pressure that had once been tied to the bed itself was gone. Even the subtle hesitation he used to feel before turning off the lights disappeared entirely. He also noticed that his sleep, once fragmented and uneasy, began to stabilize. He no longer woke repeatedly during the night, and when he did wake, it was without alarm or immediate tension. The room no longer felt divided into areas of discomfort and avoidance. It returned to being a single, ordinary space where rest was possible without internal resistance. The change in atmosphere was not described by him in emotional terms. He did not speak of relief in an exaggerated way. Instead, he spoke in simple terms of restoration. The room felt normal again. The house no longer carried the same weight it once did. Even his wife, who had not fully understood the intensity of his experience, noticed that his behavior during the night had changed. He no longer positioned himself away from one side of the bed. He no longer woke abruptly or reached for the light switch in panic. In examining this case, the key point is not to reduce it to a single simplistic explanation. The Church does not encourage either excessive skepticism or careless interpretation. What it does insist upon is discernment. Not every disturbance is spiritual in origin, but not every disturbance can be dismissed without investigation either. There is a balanced understanding that takes both the material and spiritual dimensions of human experience seriously. What this case demonstrates is a pattern that has been observed in various forms throughout the history of pastoral ministry. When objects associated with practices contrary to God are placed in intimate living spaces, especially in areas connected to rest and vulnerability, they can become focal points for disturbance in a person's interior life. This does not mean that the object itself has independent power. Rather, it becomes part of a larger interaction between perception, imagination, and spiritual influence. Once the object was removed, the conditions that had centered around it ceased. The change was not gradual in his description. It was decisive. The cold did not slowly diminish over weeks. It stopped. The smell did not fade slowly over time. It disappeared. The sense of presence that had been tied to the room did not weaken gradually. It ended. From a theological perspective, this aligns with the Church's teaching that spiritual oppression of the kind described as obsession operates through proximity, attention, and permission. When the focal point is removed and the spiritual order of the environment is restored through sacramental means, the influence loses its foothold. The sacramentals used in the room, including the Blessed Crucifix and the image of the Blessed Virgin Mary, are not symbolic decorations in this context. They represent a deliberate reestablishment of spiritual orientation toward God. It is also important to emphasize that the Church's sacramental life is not presented as a set of optional practices for the especially devout. It is understood as the ordinary means by which grace is communicated and spiritual order is maintained. The Eucharist, confession, prayer, and sacramentals are not extraordinary interventions reserved for extreme cases. They are the normal structure of Catholic life. When they are neglected over time, the result is not immediate collapse, but gradual vulnerability. This case also highlights something more subtle. The man did not experience his difficulties because he lacked belief. He believed. He practiced the faith outwardly. What was missing was consistency in the lived structure of that belief. Prayer had diminished. Confession had become infrequent. Sacramentals were absent from the home. In that absence, his experience became disordered in ways he could not initially interpret correctly. The resolution, therefore, was not dramatic confrontation but restoration of order. The object was removed, the space was blessed, the sacramental life was renewed, and the effects that had been centered on that object ceased. What remained was a return to ordinary life, which in this context is precisely what was needed. Finally, what this case teaches is not fear but responsibility. The Church's tradition consistently emphasizes that the ordinary means of grace are sufficient for protection and stability. The sacraments are not abstract rituals. They are concrete realities that shape and defend the life of the believer. When they are neglected, gaps appear. When they are restored, order returns. There is no need to interpret every difficulty as extraordinary, but there is also no wisdom in ignoring patterns that persist without natural explanation. Discernment requires both clarity of thought and humility about what we do not fully understand. And in the end, the lesson is simple. The home is not only a physical space, it is also a moral and spiritual one. What is placed within it, what is neglected within it, and what is restored within it, all matter more than most people realize. In this case, once the disorder was removed and the proper order restored, the disturbance ended and life returned to its ordinary course.